In the second half of the 20th century, the post-World War II decolonization wave was sweeping the old imperial powers of Europe from their colonies in Africa. Some colonies would become independent peacefully through negotiations and gradual transfer of power to local elites, while others had to fight bloody wars of liberation against their former overlords. But the Rhodesian Bush War was a rather special case. Known also as the Rhodesian Civil War, Zimbabwe War of Liberation, and the Second Chimurenga, it was a situation where the imperial power, Britain, wanted to give its colony to the indigenous African majority, which was opposed by the local white minority that did not want to lose its power. Welcome to our video about the war in the heart of Africa that lasted from 1964 to 1979 and created modern Zimbabwe. This video is sponsored by our YouTube members and patrons, who get 2 exclusive videos weekly, not available anywhere else, for their kind support of our channel. You can join their ranks to watch more than 160 videos, including our series on the Pacific War, Punic Wars, Persian Wars, Spanish War of Succession, Russo-Japanese War, North African Campaign of World War II, History of Prussia, Italian Unification Wars, Risorgimento, Albigensian Crusades, and much more. Click the link in the description or pinned comment to get the exclusive videos, early access to all public videos, our schedule, wallpapers, access to a special Discord server where we're very active, and much more. Thanks for supporting us, we couldn't be doing it without your help. Being a landlocked country, Zimbabwe, known to Europeans as Rhodesia, did not have much interaction with the European colonialists until the 19th century. Back in the 16th century, Portuguese explorers established contact with the tribes populating modern-day Zimbabwe and traded with them before trying to colonize this land by force a century later. This attempt was thwarted by the Rosvi Empire, a state established and run by the Shona people, who managed to defeat the Portuguese. Zimbabwe would not be much bothered again by Europeans until the late 1800s, when it entered a period unlike any other in its history. In 1860, Cecil John Rhodes, a man engaged in the mining business in South Africa, acquired mining rights in Zimbabwe after negotiations with local tribal leaders, triggering the first influx of white miners into Zimbabwe. 3 years later, British settlers capitalized on the dispute between the Shona and the Ndebele tribes to take over the country, forcing the local population into the so-called tribal trust areas. This new British colony was named Rhodesia. Over the next decades, some 230,000 English settlers moved into Rhodesia, populating mainly the southern regions, which had a milder climate. Rhodesia was ruled by the British South Africa Company, which had its own military force that they used to defend the settlers. It was involved in the suppression of the Matabele and Shona rebellions of the late 19th century as well. In 1923, Britain gave Zimbabwe self-governance and a new name, South Rhodesia. In 1926, the government introduced compulsory military service for white males, which played a major role in the militarization of the white community in Zimbabwe. The white settlers of Rhodesia gained even more military experience by fighting in World War II on the side of Britain. There were over 200,000 white people living in Zimbabwe at the time, which constituted only 6 or 7% of the entire population of the country. Despite being a majority, the native blacks of the region had almost no political power and lacked access to the best land and economic resources in Zimbabwe. Inevitably, the black majority started to organize to oppose this state of affairs. In 1957, civil disobedience campaigns were launched by the African Nationalists. In a campaign initially led by the Southern Rhodesia African National Congress, they demanded equal political, social and economic rights. This non-violent group campaigned against racism and the discriminatory land policy of the white minority government. They supported the expansion of access to education for black children and demanded black representation in the government. This movement coincided with the civil rights movement in the United States and was even praised by Martin Luther King. Initially, the Rhodesian government of Garfield Todd was responsive to some of these frank demands, agreeing to raise minimum wages for black workers and giving restaurants an opportunity to stop segregation on their premises. Todd even pushed for more black people to receive voting rights. However, perhaps unbeknownst to him, he was going against the grain in his party at the time, and in 1959 he was ousted for his liberal policies. The new government of Edgar Whitehead banned the African National Congress and detained hundreds of its members and supporters. The Whitehead government adopted measures that made peaceful protest practically impossible. essentially outlawing freedom of assembly for black people. Despite this, the black people of Zimbabwe made another attempt at peaceful organizing and created the National Democratic Party, which was more or less an heir of strength. But the space for non-violent action was shrinking further. In 1961, the National Democratic Party was banned as well. The suppression of the civil disobedience campaigns strengthened the militant camp of the African nationalists in Zimbabwe, who believed that it was time for an armed struggle. This paved the way for the creation of the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU, on the 17th of December 1961, only 10 days after the ban on the NDP. 2 years later, the Zimbabwe African National Union, or ZANU, splintered from the ZAPU, largely on the basis of tribal loyalties. Even though the white minority government managed to suppress the political aspirations of the black majority for a while, the international trend was not in its favor. With black anti-colonial liberation movements going on in many African countries, the pressure on Britain to change the state of affairs in Zimbabwe was increasing. In 1953, the British government adopted what was an interim measure at best by creating the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. But this new geopolitical unit was short-lived. After World War II, Britain gradually gave up its colonial possessions throughout the world, and British Prime Minister Macmillan's Winds of Change speech in 1960 to the South African Parliament indicated Britain's intent to see the transition of power to black majorities in its African colonies. In 1964, Nyasaland became independent as the Republic of Malawi, and Northern Rhodesia as the country of Zambia. But the same did not happen in South Rhodesia, where the political and economic power of white colonists was still very strong. The Rhodesian Front Party, which insisted on white rule in South Rhodesia, was formed in 1962, and soon came to power, with Ian Smith becoming the Prime Minister of this colony in 1964. A year later, he proclaimed the independence of South Rhodesia from Britain, intending to continue the white rule in the country. Tensions in Rhodesia were about to reach a point of no return, as the white minority chose a leader who insisted on the continuation of their power, while the black majority was getting ready to establish rule over Zimbabwe. Like virtually all wars during the Cold War era, the Rhodesian War had at least some degree of foreign interference. The Cold War era superpowers saw conflicts as an opportunity to expand their influence, add another member to their coalition, or support the side considered ideologically closer to them. The Rhodesia War was no exception in that sense, so let's look at the sides of this war and try to understand its Cold War context. On one side, there was the white minority government of Ian Smith, which controlled the military and security forces of Rhodesia. Even though the white population was only 220,000 according to the census of 1961, its military was formidable, and particularly towards the end of the conflict, the whole white community was militarized. The Rhodesian army had a history of fighting on the side of Britain in world wars, and had storied units like the Rhodesian African Rifles and the Rhodesian Light Infantry. It also had elite units like the Selous Scouts, who specialized in anti-guerrilla warfare and operations behind enemy lines. The Rhodesian Special Air Service also specialized in clandestine operations on enemy territory. The police force of South Rhodesia, called the British South African Police, also participated in the war. The Rhodesian Air Force consisted of 71 aircraft, including 12 Hawker Hunter fighter bombers, 17 Canberra light bombers, 14 Vampire bombers, 8 C-47 Dakota transports, 12 Provost T-52 trainers, and 8 Alouette 3 helicopters. They were widely considered the second strongest African Air Force, which was composed of some 1,300 trained men. To summarize, the South Rhodesian military was quite powerful for a former colony which had just proclaimed its independence. The biggest shortcoming was the small population, which inevitably put limits on its mobilization potential. Thus, eventually, almost all white males of the conscription age took part in the Rhodesian War in some shape. Most Western governments in Europe and North America did not want to have anything in common with the new South Rhodesian government, and did not recognize its independence. This was the era when anti-colonialism was a powerful factor in geopolitics, and for the Canadas, United States and European Unions of the world, supporting a minority colonizer government would harm one's reputation immensely. Thus, both the United States and Britain supported sanctions against South Rhodesia when the UN adopted them in 1966. The South Rhodesian government would call the African nationalist organizations communist-trained terrorists. The Rhodesian Foreign Minister, Van der Bijl, stated that This is not a racial war, but black terrorists and white-skinned communists on one side, and a multiracial army of black and white soldiers fighting shoulder to shoulder on the other side. But even though the ZAPU and ZANU clearly cooperated with the Soviet Union, China, and other countries of the socialist bloc, the cost of supporting a government going against the international trend and supporting what many considered a racist establishment was just too high for the Western coalition. Thus, South Rhodesia was supported only by fellow colonial governments in Mozambique, where the African nationalists of Frelimo had been fighting to oust Portuguese rule, and obviously the South African apartheid government, which saw a natural ally in South Rhodesia. The Portuguese helped the South Rhodesians for a while by preventing ZANU and ZAPU incursions from their territory. South Africa provided direct military aid by sending helicopters and police forces to support South Rhodesia and ensure its economic survival when it was facing international sanctions. According to an economic report from 1967, 2/3 of Rhodesian exports went to South Africa, which helped them stay afloat economically. Now let us have a look at the African nationalist side of the war. We have already mentioned that ZAPU and ZANU were the driving forces behind the struggle for the black majority for liberation. This raises the question of why they had two organizations instead of acting as a united front. In 1963, a group of ZAPU members, dissatisfied with Joshua Nkomo's leadership, left and created ZANU under the leadership of Reverend Ndabaningi Sithole and the future president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe. Both the ZAPU and ZANU had their own military wing. ZANU's military was known as the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, or ZANLA, while ZAPU's military was known as the Zimbabwe People's Liberation Army, or ZIPRA. In 1963, both parties decided to go into exile and organize guerrilla warfare against the Rhodesian government. ZANLA was an organization dominated by the ethnic Shona people that mostly operated out of Zambia. But when the Portuguese left Mozambique, ZANLA started conducting most of its operations from there as well. ZANLA was supported by China militarily and trained ideologically to fight in the Maoist manner. It is reported that the current president of Zimbabwe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, and 4 other ZANU-ZANLA members were sent to China in 1963 for military training. In 1969, China started training ZANU fighters on the tenets of the Maoist ideology in Utumbu, Tanzania. These Maoist guerrilla tactics enabled them to preserve most of their forces while continuously putting pressure on the South Rhodesians. In contrast, ZIPRA, the military wing of ZAPU, was supported by the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites. The organization was based on the Ndebele ethnic group and was led by Joshua Nkomo. ZIPRA was more of a conventional military force based on the Soviet military model. Its strategy was to watch the Rhodesian military and ZANLA bleed each other out until an opportune moment for a conventional military offensive arose for ZIPRA to take advantage of. ZIPRA also sent its fighters to train in the Soviet Union and East Germany. In a nutshell, ZANLA focused more on ideological and political solidarity and hierarchy within the organization, which in the long term helped them get a legitimate advantage over ZIPRA, which possessed stricter military control but a weaker political organization. The ideological and ethnic differences caused occasional violent infighting between these parties. Both the white government and the African nationalists created strategies and pushed narratives to take advantage of Cold War-era geopolitics. The Smith government sought to capitalize on the support provided to the African nationalist groups by the socialist countries, while the nationalists intended to create a situation in which the Western powers would have no other option but to interfere against the South Rhodesian government. For instance, Robert Mugabe believed that the primary purpose of the armed rebellion, particularly in its beginning, was to force the white government to react in such a way that would push Britain and others to intervene and force political transformation in favor of black rule in Zimbabwe. Among scholars, there are different opinions about when exactly the Rhodesian Bush War started. Even before the armed conflict began and the Rhodesian government declared independence, the Rhodesian military had already launched Operation Valhalla, a cordon and search operation in the 2 largest black areas of the capital of Salisbury, Harare and Highfields. Both police and the army were involved in this operation, which only stoked the flames of tension between communities in Zimbabwe. Many historians think of the 4th of July 1964 as the start of the war. On that day, ZANLA militants ambushed and killed a white civilian, Petrus Oberholzer, in the Melseta district. The Smith government reacted predictably, arresting several ZANU and ZAPU leaders, including Sithole, with the remainder of the leadership group going into exile in Zambia and other neighboring countries. This was followed by the unilateral Declaration of Independence by the Smith government on the 11th of November 1965. This was the logical conclusion of the white minority in South Rhodesia insisting on the continuation of their rule without any power sharing with the black majority. Since Britain did not want to see its colony independent without ensuring a majority-ruled government, the Ian Smith-led Rhodesian Front decided to take the radical step of proclaiming independence from Britain. In response, British Prime Minister Harold Wilson declared the declaration illegal and imposed sanctions on South Rhodesia. According to scholar of African politics Stephen Chan, once the UDI was declared in 1965, the terms of war were set. There was no going back. When it became evident to black leaders that the hope for a British intervention was in vain, they believed that there was no other option but to rebel and fight. On the 28th of April 1966, 47 Zanla fighters attempted the first major incursion deep into Rhodesian territory from Zambia. A group of them engaged with the Rhodesian army in the Battle of Sonoya, where 7 guerrillas were killed with 0 casualties for the Rhodesian side. Although purely from a military standpoint, this battle was a disaster for Zanla, for the African Nationalists, it was the start of their War of Liberation. This day is still celebrated in Zimbabwe as Chimurenga Day. The second group went to Hartley, where they laid low for a few weeks, being fed by the local population. On May 17th, they attacked a farm, killing a farmer and his wife. The Rhodesian Light Infantry and the British South Africa Police eventually killed or captured most of the group. In general, the initial phase of the war was challenging for the guerrillas. Since the vast majority of rebels left Zimbabwe, they had to cross the border to infiltrate the country. Initially, the vast majority of incursions were launched from Zambia, which was sympathetic to the Zimbabwean African Nationalist cause. But they had the mighty natural barrier, the Zambezi River, along with flat terrain, which made it difficult for the guerrillas to avoid detection. This made the job of the Rhodesian army easier, as it could concentrate relatively little manpower to prevent cross-border incursions. Whatever small groups managed to infiltrate could do little, and were eventually hunted down pretty easily by a better equipped and trained Rhodesian military. ZIPRA militants used various tactics to improve their chances of success, such as creating a series of temporary camps storing weapons and food within a day's march distance from each other to have safe havens during and after their operations. To counter this tactic, the Rhodesians employed a tactic called Fire Force. They created observation posts in many spots, which were tasked with identifying suspicious activity. This was followed up by sending in groups to gather information about a potential guerrilla movement inside a given area. The elite Selous Scouts units were often tasked with gathering such information. If they had confirmed information about the guerrilla presence, Rhodesian helicopters were sent in to attack them. Any fleeing guerrillas would be intercepted by paratroopers or other army units, which would mass in a small area to defeat the Zanla or ZIPRA group. The Rhodesian military perfected the Fire Force tactic throughout the war, and it was immensely helpful in avoiding high casualties. It must be remembered that the white population in Rhodesia was quite small, so it was imperative for them to find a way to avoid casualties as much as possible. At the time, the Rhodesian government and the military believed that Fire Force was their ticket to victory over the African Nationalists. In December 1966, talks between the Smith government and the British government aboard the HMS Tiger failed. The low-intensity war with Zanla and ZIPRA continued. These groups were also supported by the African National Congress fighters of South Africa. In August 1967, the Rhodesian army suffered its first casualties fighting against a large group of ZIPRA and ANC guerrillas near Hwange after they had infiltrated Rhodesia from the Victoria Falls area. Even though the Rhodesians inflicted a harsh defeat over the rebels in the biggest battle of the war yet, 7 soldiers were killed in action as well. The participation of the ANC fighters in this battle gave a pretext to the South African apartheid government to send its police forces to support the Rhodesians. Another major incursion took place in late December 1967. More than 120 ZIPRA and ANC fighters crossed the Zambezi and moved towards Karoi, setting up temporary bases on their route. They managed to stay undetected until March 1968, when the Rhodesian military moved in to halt them. Operation Cauldron was launched by South Rhodesia, and with the help of 4 bombers, they started patrolling the area looking for guerrillas. On March 18th, they detected temporary camps and destroyed them before engaging with the rebels. This battle lasted until late May, with 69 guerrillas and 6 Rhodesian soldiers killed, while yet more guerrillas were captured or fled to Zambia. The success of keeping the rebels at bay with minimal casualties emboldened the Smith government to reject a further attempt by the British government to find a diplomatic solution to the conflict in October 1968, when another round of negotiations aboard the HMS Fearless failed. A further blow to the African nationalist cause was dealt when fighting erupted between Zanla and Zipra, coupled with a temporary suspension of aid from the Organisation of African Unity. They were accused of plotting against the President of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, and were expelled from the country in 1971. Another attempt at a negotiated solution was made in late 1971, this time with the representation of black Zimbabwean leaders like Bishop Abel Muzorewa. The negotiations were led by the British government-appointed Commission of Lord Pearce, but no breakthrough was achieved in this round of talks either. The Rhodesians were the clear victors in the first phase of the war and looked confident continuing on this path. Soon, however, the geopolitical situation began changing in favour of the African nationalists. Throughout the late 1960s and the early 1970s, guerrilla activity inside Zimbabwe had not been particularly impactful, and it became a period of reorganization for them in some sense. This was when their training with Soviet, Chinese, and Cuban instructors intensified. We have already talked about the difficulties of using Zambia as the primary base of operations for the rebels, and after they were expelled from that country, they had to find an alternative. Thankfully for them, by the early 1970s, the anti-colonialist movement of Frelimo was succeeding in Mozambique against the Portuguese army. There, the Portuguese were outnumbered and essentially pinned down by Frelimo, which enabled Zanla to relocate to Mozambique, particularly the Tete province. This gave the African nationalists a much better base of operations and forced the small Rhodesian army to man an additional front. Moreover, ZANU started focusing on winning the hearts and minds of the black rural areas. According to Stoneman and Cliff, authors of Zimbabwe, Politics, Economics and Society, ZANU's strategy was to politicize the rural areas, enabling them to establish camps there in order to launch ambushes on Rhodesian forces and lay mines on roads used by them. By 1972, Zanla had managed to gain a steady foothold in the Chaweshe Tribal Trust territory of northeast Zimbabwe. The Rhodesian army simply did not have enough personnel to patrol the whole vast territory of Zimbabwe effectively, which is why, for them, it was crucial to stop the rebel incursions on the border whenever possible. They had done this effectively so far, but now they also had to face Zanla's camps embedded within Zimbabwe, which was an entirely different challenge. On the 21st of December 1972, Zanla launched an attack on Altena Farm with a group of 10, led by Rex Nhongo. While all they managed in this attack was to inflict some damage on the farm and injure one civilian, it was a sign of things to come. Zanla was gaining more freedom to operate inside Zimbabwe. According to Professor of African History Jean Cilliers, not only had Zanla succeeded in establishing a relatively secure base area inside Rhodesia, but they had also succeeded in obtaining the full cooperation and support of the black population within the area. This proved a crucial factor in their later successes and in the way the Rhodesian government attempted to eradicate the threat. The Rhodesians responded by increasing the frequency of army patrols in the northeast and extending the period of conscription from 9 months to 1 year, in order to have more manpower at their disposal. Additionally, black volunteer troops began being recruited into the Rhodesian army. The Rhodesian government intended to create a cordon sanitaire on the border with Mozambique by laying mines along it. However, this did not help the Rhodesians much, as guerrillas often breached the minefields quite easily in areas not manned by the Rhodesian army. In order to protect white civilians from the guerrilla attacks, the government relocated some of them to protected villages. Despite some problems with the guerrilla incursions, in 1973, the Rhodesian government was still confident that they had the situation under control. According to Cilliers, in 1973, the Rhodesian army lost 44 servicemen against 179 guerrilla casualties. Despite the sanctions, the Rhodesian economy was also doing well, thanks to trade with South Africa, along with import substitution-led growth, which was at 7%, according to Stoneman and Cliff. However, it was not all good news for the Rhodesians, as the Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1974 brought down the regime in that country, which had been supportive of them. The new government in Portugal declared that they were going to give up their colonies. As a result, in June 1973, Frelimo assumed power in Mozambique. This was great news for the African nationalist groups, who could now operate from Mozambique even more freely, significantly expanding the area of operations that the Rhodesian military now had to pay attention to. Moreover, Rhodesian exports and oil supplies were passing through the Mozambican ports of Beira and Maputo. Along with that, the Portuguese army in Mozambique helped the Rhodesians with intelligence and logistics. In response to these geopolitical setbacks, the Smith government increased defense spending and recruited even more foreign fighters to its cause. Meanwhile, instead of immediately taking advantage of their new situation, the rebel camp got mired in infighting. In November of 1974, the Zanla fighter Thomas Nahari launched an uprising against the ZANU leadership, accusing them of living luxurious lifestyles. ZANU ruthlessly crushed the rebellion, but later many ZANU leaders were imprisoned by Zambia. Thus, rebellion and the consequent repression against ZANU leaders inflicted a temporary blow to the rebellion. However, the situation for the South Rhodesian government was becoming more complicated as well. They would regularly conduct cross-border operations in Mozambique to inflict damage on guerrillas, but the massive manpower advantage of African nationalists was becoming a major factor as the war dragged on. Along with that, now lacking support from the Portuguese, South Africa remained the main ally of South Rhodesia. But at this time, the Vorster government of South Africa had started to seek détente with numerous African states. Facing increasing criticism on the world stage for its apartheid regime, it was important for South Africa to improve its international reputation. As part of this push, Vorster organised another round of talks between the Smith government and the black leaders, with Bishop Abel Muzorewa offered to represent the latter. As a gesture of goodwill, the Rhodesians released Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe, who by 1975 were accepted as leaders of the black majority. The sides even agreed to a temporary ceasefire to facilitate talks, but this ceasefire was broken on the 16th of December 1974 when the guerrillas attacked South African policemen. Even after that, the talks continued deep into 1975 but led to nothing of substance. South Africa even put pressure on the Rhodesian government to reach a negotiated agreement with the black majority by withdrawing their police and adopting limits to vital exports into Rhodesia, but the Smith government did not relent, believing that they were still in control of the situation. Nevertheless, there were signs that Rhodesia was being stretched to its limits. In 1976, they extended the conscription period from 1 year to 18 months. In addition, the Rhodesian Command added 3 new operation areas: Thrasher, Repulse, and Tangent, understanding that the geography of threat to their rule was expanding, particularly due to developments in Mozambique. In mid-1976, the guerrilla incursions from Zambia restarted, while in March 1976, the new government of Mozambique declared war on Rhodesia and allowed Zanla to conduct cross-border attacks by providing them camps to operate from. Botswana also allowed the guerrillas to use its territory. The ring around Rhodesia was narrowing. On the Easter weekend of 1976, Zanla forces killed 3 white South African tourists on the main road near Fort Victoria, which demonstrated that the war, which until this point had seemed far away, was closing in on the white population of Rhodesia. After that incident, army convoys started guarding highways. Sabotage operations against railways were conducted as well, leading to similar results, as civilian transportation was restricted to daylight hours. The Rhodesian military responded by increasing cross-border operations to hit the guerrillas at their bases. It is estimated that they launched 40 raids into Mozambique in February to June of 1976. On the 5th of August 1976, Zanla guerrillas attacked the Ruda military base in Rhodesia, killing 4 soldiers. South Rhodesia retaliated by launching Operation Eland on the Nyadonzia camp in Mozambique, which served both as a training camp for Zanla and a refugee camp. Disguised as Frelimo fighters, the elite Selous scout unit infiltrated the camp on August 9th and deceived the camp inhabitants onto the parade grounds. What followed was a massacre of more than 1,000 people, at least some of whom were refugees. The international outcry was so loud that even South Africa reacted by withdrawing further personnel from Rhodesia, including its pilots, which significantly weakened the Rhodesian Air Force. This was a major problem for Rhodesia, as according to Cilia's calculations, roughly half of Rhodesia's defense budget was paid by South Africa. Smith was now forced to accept another round of talks to settle the war, this time mediated by the US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. On the 24th of September 1976, Smith publicly accepted the principle of majority rule in Rhodesia, which was a huge concession for him caused by the increasing difficulty in containing the rebellion. The talks about the necessity of a power-sharing agreement reportedly damaged the morale of the Rhodesian army, which was now facing threats from 3 sides. While the talks were ongoing, both Zanla and Zipra increased their attacks on Rhodesia, restarting operations from Zambia and infiltrating Botswana. The African Nationalist camp was sensing that they were gaining the upper hand in the war and increased pressure on Rhodesia. The Smith government took drastic steps to tackle the ever-increasing threat by banning the exit of young white men from the country, ensuring the conscription of school graduates, and introducing 190 days of mandatory military service per year for all able-bodied white men up to the age of 38. They would spend 6 weeks in the army and 6 weeks at home. Curfews and martial law were imposed. Rhodesia was under siege. The displacement of the black population from many rural areas did not help to win any hearts and minds either. According to the Rhodesian intelligence chief Ken Flower, tactics such as targeted assassination of guerrillas and their sympathizers became more widespread. Sabotage operations were being conducted against the neighboring countries sympathetic to African nationalists to punish them for this. Renamo, an anti-Frelimo guerrilla organization, was created by the Rhodesians in Mozambique. On the 30th of May 1977, the Rhodesian military moved into Mapai, Mozambique, destroyed the Zanla base there, and stated their intention to continue the occupation until the guerrilla presence had been eliminated. But under international pressure, they were soon forced to leave Mapai. The war, which was largely confined to the countryside, arrived in the urban areas when a bomb explosion killed 11 civilians in Salisbury in August 1977. In response, the Rhodesian government started implementing even more stringent security measures in cities. The Rhodesians' control over the rural areas was waning as well, as guerrillas were operating rather freely there, except the protected villages, which had been likened to concentration camps. The Rhodesian army was still a stronger military force in this war, and continued conducting successful retaliatory attacks on Zanla. For instance, in November 1977, they launched a devastating cross-border operation codenamed Dingo, which killed anywhere between 1,000 and 3,000 Zanla fighters and civilians at the Chimoio and Tembue camps in Mozambique. They were inflicting massive losses on the guerrillas, but the manpower advantage of the latter and their unwavering commitment to the cause meant that they could go on with their struggle for as long as necessary. Before long, the cost of waging war against Zipra and Zanla was becoming unbearable for Rhodesia. Back in March of 1976, Ian Smith had stated, "Let me say it again. I don't believe in black majority rule ever in Rhodesia, not in 1,000 years. Now, however, he was looking for a settlement with the black majority, but he tried to exclude Nkomo, Mugabe, Zipra and Zanla from sitting at the table. Instead, he signed an internal settlement with Bishop Abel Muzorewa, Ndabaningi Sithole and Jeremiah Chirau on March 3, 1978, scheduling elections for March 1979. Per the terms of this settlement, the country would be renamed Zimbabwe Rhodesia. Muzorewa would become a prime minister of the interim government after the 1979 elections, and black political parties would be allowed to participate in elections and reforms to pave the way for power sharing between white and black communities. Despite this, the white community would remain in control of the military and judiciary. Both the UN and the African nationalist leaders rejected this settlement. Both ZANU and ZAPU argued that this agreement failed to adequately tackle all the problems the black community was facing in Zimbabwe, and vowed to continue the war until their demands were met. The Smith government miscalculated once again. Muzorewa and others had long since lost the status of leaders of the African nationalists to Mugabe and Nkomo. They were largely figureheads without any significant popular support or armed groups backing them. The Rhodesian government tried to create an army for Muzorewa in the form of the Security Force Auxiliaries, or SFA, but this did not work either, as the poorly trained and undisciplined SFA only caused further lawlessness in the black rural areas. Meanwhile, the violence in the country continued to escalate. In 1978, the civilian death toll increased significantly when on September 3rd of that year, one of the most shocking incidents of this war took place with the shooting down of a civilian Air Rhodesia Viscount airliner by a Zipra missile. 38 passengers died during the crash, while the others were killed by Zipra at the crash site. Zipra struck another civilian plane in January 1979. In retaliation, the Rhodesian Air Force, clandestinely supported by the South African Air Force, launched airstrikes on the guerrilla bases in Zambia and Mozambique. These were painful blows for the black nationalists, but again not nearly enough to alter the situation. Zanla and Zipra were confident in exhausting the Rhodesian forces by constantly keeping them under pressure and inflicting their own blows. On the 12th of December 1978, Zanla struck the main oil depot storage of Salisbury, causing major destruction. Rhodesia lost 500,000 barrels of oil in a single day, which was a significant blow to its total oil supplies. A few weeks later, guerrillas attacked the Salisbury airport. These two incidents clearly demonstrated that they were now capable of launching attacks on the capital. At this point, both Zanla and Zipra had a considerable presence inside Zimbabwe and conducted regular incursions from the neighbouring countries. The Rhodesian economy was suffering, while the army struggled to contain the threat. As we mentioned before, the agreement between Smith and Muzorewa was rejected by both ZANU and ZAPU. Even the latter's election as the first black prime minister in the history of Zimbabwe was not enough to persuade them otherwise. The election of Muzorewa eased the international pressure on Zimbabwe-Rhodesia, but the war continued, thus increasing calls for finding a final settlement of the conflict. In August 1979, the Commonwealth heads of government meeting in Lusaka urged Britain to intervene and find a solution to this war, which had been causing so much death and destruction in several African countries. As a result, in September 1979, the government of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher convened the Lancaster House Conference. This time, all relevant parties, including Mugabe, Nkomo, Smith, Muzorewa, and others, were present to reach the final settlement under British mediation. The pressure was not only on the Rhodesian government, but on nationalist leaders as well. According to former Rhodesian intelligence officer Ken Flower, the Mozambican President Samora Machel pressured Mugabe to accept the settlement. Evidently, Mozambique was also tired of this war, which had wreaked havoc in their country as well. Ultimately, the sides agreed to a ceasefire. Soon, they also reached an agreement on a new constitution and set a date for elections, during which the sides would be able to campaign peacefully. 20% of the parliament seats would be reserved for white MPs. Zimbabwe-Rhodesia would revoke the unilateral Declaration of Independence and would formally and temporarily once again become a British colony under the name South Rhodesia until the election. Britain would monitor the implementation of the agreed-upon provisions. The Rhodesian military would be confined to their barracks, while the guerrillas were ordered to gather in designated assembly points. On the 21st of December 1979, the Lancaster House Agreement was signed. The Rhodesian Bush War was over. In March 1980, Robert Mugabe's ZANU won the elections, and he became the first internationally recognized black prime minister of Zimbabwe. Immediately, Mugabe faced challenges in rebuilding the war-torn country. According to Stoneman and Cliff, Mugabe and ZANU sought to establish stability and order in the country on the way to consolidating their own power, which eventually was going to lead to one-party rule in Zimbabwe. Another major challenge was creating a unified army out of the Rhodesian army, Zanla and Zipra. A British military training team was tasked with this integration work, which was a difficult thing to accomplish. After all, they had been fighting against each other for over a decade. In November 1980, the Minister of Finance, Enos Nkala, made a speech denouncing ZANU, which eventually led to a firefight between Zipra and Zanla fighters in Bulawayo, leaving dozens dead. This incident was only quelled after the intervention of a white-led unit. Another escalation took place only 3 months later, this time leaving hundreds dead. Once again, the intervention of the former Rhodesian military units on the side of the government settled the conflict in its favour. These events pushed Mugabe to pursue harsher policies against his rivals. In 1983–87, the 5th Brigade of the Zimbabwean Army, trained by North Korea and loyal to the government, carried out mass killings of ZAPU members and the Ndebele and Kalanga peoples. Thousands were killed. After winning the Chimurenga War, now Mugabe managed to create a personalized rule in Zimbabwe and solidify his power. He would go on to rule Zimbabwe as a de facto dictator for the next 3 decades. The Rhodesian Bush War ended with the victory of the African nationalists, resulting in the fall of the white minority regime of Ian Smith after more than a decade of bitter war, which killed over 1,300 Rhodesian forces, tens of thousands of Zanla and Zipra fighters, and thousands of civilians. Millions of landmines laid on Zimbabwean territory are still killing people to this day. The attempt of the white settlers to maintain their power at a time of the anti-colonial wave proved futile, as it stood little chance in the war of attrition waged by the guerrillas, resolute in their goal of restoring black rule in Zimbabwe. Unfortunately, the destruction of the war was followed by a Mugabe dictatorship and the economic collapse of Zimbabwe. Mugabe was eventually toppled by a combination of popular protests and army intervention in 2017. But the people of Zimbabwe continue to struggle with similar problems in the post-Mugabe era too. More videos on decolonization and the history of Africa are on the way. To make sure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.